Snow did not arrive quietly in the 1500s. When the first heavy storms rolled over towns and villages, daily life slowed in ways that modern people rarely experience. There were no weather forecasts, no snowplows, and no heated cars waiting outside. A sudden snowfall could transform an ordinary day into a struggle against cold, distance, and uncertainty. In many parts of Europe and Asia, winter storms reshaped entire landscapes overnight. Roads that had been dusty paths the day before disappeared beneath thick white layers. Travelers sometimes woke up in roadside inns only to find that the route ahead had vanished under drifting snow. Horses struggled to pull carts through icy ruts, and journeys that should have taken hours stretched into days. Some merchants simply abandoned their wagons and waited for the weather to soften. Villages became quiet islands during these storms. Narrow streets filled with packed snow and wooden doors remained closed for longer than usual. Families gathered close to fireplaces, feeding the flames with carefully saved firewood. Heat was never guaranteed. A household that misjudged its winter supply might face freezing nights before spring returned. Snow also created unexpected work. Roofs built from wood, straw, or clay tiles could not always support heavy accumulation. Men climbed onto slippery surfaces with long poles to push away thick layers before the weight collapsed the structure beneath. The task was dangerous. A single misstep could send someone sliding into the frozen ground below. Animals suffered as much as people. Livestock barns were often cold and poorly insulated. Farmers spent long hours breaking ice that formed in water troughs so their animals could drink. Chickens and goats needed extra feed because grazing was impossible under the snow. When supplies ran low, difficult decisions followed. Markets, the lifeblood of many towns, often fell silent after a storm. Traders from nearby villages stayed home and fresh goods stopped arriving. What remained in storage, grains, salted meat, dried beans, suddenly became precious. Prices sometimes rose simply because carts could not reach the town square. For children, however, snow carried a different meaning. In scattered diary notes and local accounts from the period, there are hints of excitement. Young people ran through fields, threw handfuls of powder into the air, and carved simple sleds from wood. Even in a century shaped by hardship, winter still had moments of wonder. The military also felt the force of winter storms. Armies moving through mountain passes or open plains could be slowed dramatically by deep snow. Soldiers marching in heavy clothing exhausted themselves quickly, and supply wagons often lagged far behind. Campaigns occasionally stalled entirely until the weather shifted. Religious life adapted to the season as well. Church bells continued to ring, but attendance dropped during severe weather. People sometimes walked through knee-deep snow just to reach Sunday services. Inside the stone buildings, breath could be seen in the cold air, while candles flickered along the walls. Despite the difficulties, communities developed quiet routines that helped them survive winter after winter. Firewood stacks were checked constantly. Grain stores were guarded carefully. Paths between homes were trampled down so neighbors could still reach one another. Snow in that era was not just scenery, it was an obstacle that shaped decisions, habits, and even the rhythm of conversation. When the storms finally passed, the landscape often looked peaceful, almost untouched. But beneath that calm surface were days of effort, patience, and endurance. For people living in the 1500s, snowfall was never just weather. It was a test of preparation, resilience, and the fragile balance between comfort and survival. A violent winter storm in the 16th century could redraw the map of daily life in a matter of hours. Paths between villages vanished first. What had been recognizable trails across fields or hills dissolved under wind-driven drifts. People navigating familiar terrain suddenly relied on memory rather than sight, counting steps, trees, and fences hidden somewhere beneath the frozen surface. Losing direction in such conditions was frighteningly easy. Farmers who lived outside town walls faced the harshest isolation. A small farmhouse surrounded by open land might disappear entirely under snowbanks taller than a person. Doors had to be forced open from the inside each morning. Windows sometimes froze from the edges inward, shrinking the pale daylight that reached the interior. Families moved slowly through dim rooms, wrapped in thick wool and animal skins, conserving both warmth and energy. Food preparation changed during long stretches of severe weather. Cooking fires burned longer because frozen ingredients needed time to thaw near the hearth. Hard loaves softened only after being warmed, and dried meat required soaking before it could be eaten. Pots hung above the flames for hours, releasing steady steam into cold air that carried the smell of broth, onions, and stored herbs. Inside towns, narrow alleys became narrow trenches cut through compacted snow. Residents shoveled pathways using wooden boards or iron tools when they had them. In wealthier districts, servants cleared entrances repeatedly throughout the day. Elsewhere, neighbors worked together simply to keep a route open between homes. Communication depended on those narrow passages. Without them, even a short walk could become exhausting. Trade routes were especially vulnerable during harsh winters. Merchant caravans traveling between regional markets slowed to a crawl. Wheels struggled in frozen mud beneath the snow, and animals tired quickly in biting winds. Some traders planned their journeys around seasonal pauses, storing goods in small roadside depots until the worst storms passed. Others took risks and pushed forward, gambling that demand for their cargo would outweigh the danger. Water itself became difficult to access. Wells froze near the surface, forcing people to break the forming ice each morning before lowering buckets. In extremely cold weeks, hauling water required patience and strength. A dropped bucket might freeze instantly against the well wall, turning a simple task into an hour of chipping and pulling. The soundscape of winter changed dramatically too. Snow absorbed noise, muting the usual clatter of carts, animals, and market activity. Footsteps produced soft crunching echoes rather than sharp taps on stone. Distant voices carried strangely far across frozen fields. Travelers sometimes reported hearing conversations from houses they could barely see through swirling flakes. Clothing played a crucial role in survival. People layered garments made from wool, linen, and fur, fastening them with cords or simple metal clasps. Gloves were rare for poorer families, so hands were often wrapped in cloth strips. Boots lined with straw helped keep feet warm, although the straw had to be replaced frequently once it became damp. City authorities occasionally attempted to manage winter conditions, though their methods were limited. In some larger towns, officials ordered citizens to clear snow away from gates and main roads so carts delivering grain could still enter. Failure to help sometimes resulted in fines. Such efforts reflected how critical transportation remained even during the coldest months. Livestock management required constant attention. Barns filled with the warm breath of animals standing close together. Farmers used thick bedding made of straw or dried leaves to insulate the floors. Even so, calves and lambs born in winter faced difficult odds. A sudden drop in temperature could mean the loss of animals that represented a family's livelihood. In forests and mountainous regions, snowfall influenced hunting patterns. Game animals changed their movements once the ground hardened. Hunters followed tracks pressed into fresh snow, sometimes traveling long distances across silent landscapes. A successful hunt during winter could mean preserved meat that lasted weeks. Large rivers sometimes froze enough to carry weight. When that happened, people cautiously crossed surfaces that would normally require boats or bridges. Temporary markets occasionally appeared on frozen riverbeds, where fishermen drilled holes through ice to reach water below. These unusual scenes lasted only as long as the cold remained strong enough to support them. Travelers' letters from the 16th century occasionally mention strange sights during winter storms. Entire orchards buried beneath white drifts, wind shaping snow into curved ridges like waves on a frozen sea, lantern light glowing faintly through heavy snowfall as someone approached along a barely visible path.
Medical knowledge during that era offered limited protection from extreme cold. Frostbite and illness were constant concerns. People recognized early warning signs through experience rather than scientific understanding. Pale skin, numb fingers, persistent shivering. These were signals to move closer to heat, if heat was available at all. Even routine tasks demanded extra effort. Grinding grain at a mill required breaking ice that formed along the water wheel. Bakers woke earlier than usual because dough rose slowly in cold kitchens. Blacksmiths welcomed winter customers since their furnaces created warmth, drawing villagers inside not only for repairs but for conversation. Messages between settlements traveled more slowly once snow covered the land. Riders carrying letters moved cautiously to avoid hidden hazards beneath drifts. In certain areas, sleds replaced wheeled carts, sliding over packed snow pulled by horses or oxen. These sled journeys could be surprisingly swift on flat terrain. Occasionally, a winter season became memorable enough to enter local memory for generations. Chroniclers described years when snowfall lasted for weeks without interruption, burying fences, gardens, and even small buildings. Such winters reshaped harvest expectations for the following year, since livestock losses and delayed planting affected future food supplies.
Daily routines continued despite these challenges. Bread was baked, fires were fed, animals were cared for, and tools were repaired. Life did not pause, it simply moved more slowly, constrained by the limits imposed by weather. Across the 16th century landscape, winter functioned almost like an invisible ruler. It dictated when roads could be traveled, how food was stored, and how communities interacted with their surroundings. Snowfall did more than decorate fields and rooftops. It quietly rearranged the structure of everyday existence, forcing people to adjust their habits, their schedules, and sometimes their expectations for survival until the thaw returned. Wind sometimes carried winter across the land like a moving wall. In the 16th century, people did not speak about weather systems or atmospheric pressure, yet they understood the warning signs. A pale sky, sudden silence in the fields, restless animals. These signals meant the cold was gathering strength somewhere beyond the horizon. Rural communities often experienced the first shock of heavy snow before towns did. Fields that had recently been harvested vanished beneath thick layers that erased every boundary. Stone markers, hedges, and narrow irrigation ditches disappeared from sight. Farmers walking outside their homes stepped into a landscape stripped of its usual structure. Only distant hills or church towers provided orientation. Transportation relied heavily on animals, and snowstorms placed enormous strain on them. Horses pulling carts could slip on icy ground hidden beneath fresh powder. Oxen moved more slowly, but sometimes handled difficult conditions better because of their weight and steadiness. Drivers guided them carefully, shouting commands that faded into the wind. Inside households, winter nights stretched long and quiet. Artificial lighting came mostly from candles or oil lamps, both expensive and used sparingly. Families gathered near whatever heat source they possessed, whether a stone hearth or a metal brazier filled with burning coals. Stories circulated in these dim rooms, tales of travelers lost in storms, of wolves approaching villages, of winters remembered as the harshest anyone had seen. For artisans, snowfall could alter the rhythm of work. Tailors and cobblers sometimes saw an increase in visitors seeking repairs to cold-weather clothing and boots. Carpenters repaired doors warped by moisture and ice. Meanwhile, outdoor trades such as masonry slowed considerably because frozen mortar became difficult to use. Large urban centers developed their own ways of coping with winter obstacles. In cities with defensive walls, the gates had to remain functional despite freezing temperatures. Guards occasionally cleared ice from hinges or pathways so merchants could still enter once the weather eased. The flow of supplies into a city was never taken for granted.
Winter also revealed inequalities that existed year-round. Wealthier families insulated their homes with thicker materials, owned better clothing, and stored larger quantities of food. Poorer residents faced colder rooms and uncertain meals when storms interrupted trade. Charity from churches or local guilds sometimes helped the most vulnerable, though assistance varied greatly depending on the region. Rivers and lakes behaved unpredictably once temperatures fell. Ice sometimes formed gradually, strengthening over weeks. In other cases, sudden freezes trapped fishing boats or destroyed wooden docks. Fishermen studied the surface carefully before stepping onto it, testing thickness with poles or axes. Another aspect of snowy seasons involved communication between distant settlements. Messengers traveling with official documents occasionally struggled to maintain schedules during severe weather. Governments relied on these couriers to carry instructions, news, and reports. Delays caused by snowstorms could slow decisions that affected entire regions. Certain animals adapted to the season in ways people observed with curiosity. Deer left narrow tracks through forest snow. Wolves sometimes ventured closer to human settlements in search of food. Even birds changed their behavior. Flocks gathered near barns or grain storage areas where scattered kernels offered survival. Buildings themselves reacted differently to prolonged cold. Wooden structures contracted slightly as temperatures dropped. Iron fittings became brittle. Windows covered with thin glass sheets developed delicate frost patterns that resembled branching plants. Residents scraped these frozen shapes away to let daylight reach their rooms. Markets reopened cautiously after storms passed. Traders arrived with sleds or carts carrying preserved goods. Salted fish, dried fruit, cured meats, and grain dominated winter commerce because fresh produce was scarce. Buyers examined each item carefully, since replacement supplies might not arrive quickly. Some communities organized cooperative labor during especially heavy snowfalls. Groups of residents worked together, clearing routes between wells, barns, and storage buildings. These collective efforts strengthened social bonds because survival often depended on shared effort rather than individual strength. Monasteries played a unique role in certain regions during difficult winters. Monks maintained gardens, livestock, and food stores designed to support the religious community year-round. Travelers sometimes found temporary shelter within monastery walls when storms made further movement impossible. Navigation across open countryside became challenging once familiar paths vanished. Experienced travelers relied on landmarks such as tall trees, large rocks, or distant structures that remained visible above snowdrifts. In flatter landscapes, people followed the direction of fences buried just beneath the surface, remembering their approximate location from warmer seasons. Winter celebrations still occurred despite environmental hardship. Religious holidays provided moments of gathering and shared meals. Candles illuminated churches while snow fell quietly outside. Even modest feasts felt significant when surrounded by weeks of cold silence. In certain mountainous areas, avalanches posed additional danger. Heavy snow collecting on steep slopes could suddenly break loose, racing downward with destructive force. Villagers living below such slopes paid attention to unusual cracking sounds or shifting snow layers that hinted at potential collapse. Over time, people accumulated practical knowledge about surviving these conditions. Wood was stacked carefully before winter arrived. Food preservation techniques improved through experience. Communities that prepared well faced storms with greater confidence than those caught unready. The memory of winter lingered long after the thaw. When spring sunlight finally softened the frozen ground, rivers swelled with melting snow and roads slowly reappeared. What had seemed like endless cold eventually dissolved into mud and flowing water.
Across the 16th century world, snowstorms acted like unpredictable interruptions woven into everyday existence. They did not simply decorate the environment, they forced adjustments in travel, labor, food supply, and communication. Each storm rewrote routines in subtle ways, reminding people that survival depended not on controlling nature, but on learning to endure its sudden transformations. Dark clouds sometimes gathered without warning above 16th century landscapes, and when they finally released their weight, the result could alter an entire week of ordinary life. Snow did more than fall. It accumulated in shapes carved by the wind, burying fences, pathways, and even small sheds. A person stepping outside at dawn might discover that the familiar yard looked completely unfamiliar, as if the world had quietly rearranged itself during the night. In remote farming regions, isolation deepened once thick layers covered the ground. A farmhouse that had felt comfortably connected to neighboring properties suddenly stood alone within a silent white field. Reaching the nearest house could require trudging through waist-high drifts. Because of this, families often kept tools near their doorways during winter months. Shovels, wooden boards, and long poles used to break packed snow blocking the entrance. Meals during severe cold depended heavily on food preserved months earlier. Autumn preparation determined whether winter felt manageable or frightening. Barrels of pickled vegetables, smoked meats hanging from rafters, sacks of grain stacked in storage rooms. These supplies became the backbone of survival once snowstorms interrupted travel. Fresh produce disappeared entirely from most tables until warmer weather returned. Some villages developed unusual techniques for movement across deep snow. Instead of ordinary footwear, people tied flat wooden frames beneath their boots, spreading their weight across a wider surface. Though simple in design, these early snowshoes allowed hunters and woodcutters to cross terrain that would otherwise swallow their legs with every step. The relationship between fire and daily life grew even more important during extended cold spells. Hearths remained active for nearly the entire day, fed with logs cut months earlier. Sparks occasionally jumped from the flames and landed on nearby floors, forcing constant vigilance. Houses built primarily from wood faced the ever-present risk of accidental fire, a danger made worse by strong winter winds. Small workshops produced a different kind of warmth. Blacksmith forges glowed intensely against the surrounding frost. Inside those dim spaces, iron tools turned red and then orange beneath hammer strikes. Farmers brought broken plow parts, wagon nails, or horseshoes needing repair. The forge became a gathering point not only for work, but also for news shared between neighbors who might not otherwise meet during stormy weeks. In remote farming regions, snow transformed hunting from quiet stalking into careful tracking. Footprints left by animals stood out clearly against the pale surface. A hunter who understood these marks could read an entire story written across the forest floor, where a deer had paused, where a fox had changed direction, where birds had scratched for hidden seeds beneath the snow. Wind sometimes shaped the snow into ridges resembling frozen waves. Travelers crossing open ground faced these irregular barriers again and again, climbing over them while cold air cut through layers of clothing. Visibility dropped quickly during heavy snowfall, and a person walking only a short distance might vanish from sight. Urban neighborhoods dealt with winter in their own distinctive way. Streets that bustled with carts and traders during warmer seasons turned quiet and narrow. Snow pushed against doorways, forcing residents to clear the same spaces repeatedly as fresh flakes continued to fall. In wealthier areas, servants performed this labor throughout the day. Elsewhere, families took turns maintaining small access routes. Religious institutions rarely stopped operating entirely during winter. Bells still rang above rooftops dusted with frost, calling worshippers through the cold air. Attendance varied depending on the severity of the storm, yet some individuals walked long distances simply to attend services. Their breath lingered as mist in the frigid interior of stone buildings.
Livestock demanded attention regardless of weather. Farmers entered barns carrying lanterns before sunrise, checking whether animals remained healthy and warm enough to survive the night. Sheep huddled together for warmth. Horses stamped their hooves impatiently on straw-covered floors. Even chickens required protection from freezing temperatures that could threaten egg production. Frozen waterways occasionally became temporary roads. Once thick ice formed across rivers or lakes, sleds loaded with goods slid across surfaces that would normally require boats. These routes could shorten journeys significantly, though they also carried risk. A sudden crack beneath the ice reminded travelers that nature's shortcuts could disappear instantly. Children, less burdened by adult responsibilities, sometimes found amusement where others saw hardship. They shaped figures from packed snow, slid down gentle slopes using wooden boards, and laughed as flakes gathered in their hair. Their games introduced movement and noise into landscapes otherwise muted by winter silence. Communication across long distances slowed dramatically whenever snowfall persisted for several days. Messengers carrying written letters rode cautiously along uncertain roads, guiding their horses step by step through icy sections. Important news sometimes arrived weeks later than expected because storms repeatedly interrupted the route. Clothing designed for warmth often relied on materials readily available at the time. Thick wool cloaks covered most of the body, while fur linings protected against wind. Scarves wrapped around faces left only the eyes exposed to the cold air. Although these garments lacked the efficiency of modern winter gear, they represented generations of practical experience. Large estates sometimes organized groups of workers to maintain access roads connecting fields, barns, and storage buildings. Using wooden shovels or heavy planks, laborers pushed snow aside until narrow lanes reappeared. These efforts helped preserve movement within the estate even when surrounding countryside remained buried. Beyond the practical difficulties, winter produced a strange visual beauty that people occasionally described in letters or chronicles. Moonlight reflecting across untouched snow illuminated entire landscapes without the need for torches. Trees coated in frost sparkled when morning sunlight reached them. Even hardened farmers paused briefly to observe these quiet scenes. Yet the season never allowed anyone to forget its harsher side. Prolonged cold damaged crops stored in poorly insulated buildings. Animals weakened when feed supplies dwindled. Long journeys became dangerous calculations, balancing necessity against risk. Gradually, subtle changes signaled the approaching end of winter. Icicles dripping from rooftops shortened during warmer afternoons. Streams hidden beneath snow began to murmur again as water moved more freely. Birds returned cautiously, testing the changing air. By the time the last patches of snow finally retreated into shaded corners of the landscape, months of adaptation had already passed. Communities emerged from that long stretch of cold, carrying fresh memories of endurance, cooperation, and occasional loss. The thaw did not erase what winter demanded. Instead, it left behind quiet reminders of how deeply the season shaped the lives of those who faced it centuries ago. A sudden stillness often preceded the arrival of another heavy snowfall during the 16th century. Fields grew silent. Animals shifted uneasily in barns, and the air carried a dull brightness that hinted at what was about to happen. When the storm finally broke, flakes descended steadily, covering rooftops, fences, and pathways until the outlines of entire villages softened into pale shapes beneath the sky. Within stone houses and timber cottages, people adapted their routines to the slower pace imposed by deep winter. Indoor tasks gained new importance. Women spun wool beside the hearth, guiding thread across wooden spindles while embers glowed nearby. The rhythm of the spinning wheel filled rooms that might otherwise have felt too quiet during long nights. Food storage spaces became places of constant attention. Barrels filled with fermented vegetables, sacks of dried peas, smoked sausages hanging from rafters. These supplies represented months of preparation. A careless mistake in autumn, such as poorly sealing a container, could mean hunger before the next harvest. Families therefore inspected their stores regularly, checking for dampness, spoilage, or invading rodents. Travel across snowy terrain demanded creativity. Instead of attempting to force wheeled carts through deep drifts, many people relied on simple sleds constructed from wood. These sleds slid smoothly on packed snow when pulled by animals or even by human strength. Though modest in appearance, they allowed firewood, grain, and tools to be moved between locations that would otherwise remain unreachable. Mountain settlements encountered additional complications. Strong winds racing through narrow passes could pile snow into enormous banks that blocked entire routes. Traders accustomed to crossing these paths during warmer seasons sometimes waited weeks before attempting the journey again. Meanwhile, local residents navigated narrow trails known only through experience and memory. The cold influenced the behavior of materials themselves. Leather stiffened when exposed to freezing air, making boots harder to bend. Metal tools chilled quickly and stuck painfully to bare skin. Water left in wooden buckets developed thin sheets of ice that cracked loudly when struck. Even communication inside a household changed during harsh weather. Voices carried differently in cold rooms where thick clothing muffled movement. People leaned closer together while speaking near the fire, their conversations drifting slowly upward with the smoke that escaped through chimneys. Agricultural work did not disappear entirely during winter months. Farmers repaired equipment used during planting and harvesting seasons. Plow handles were reshaped, broken handles replaced, and wooden parts strengthened with iron fittings. These quiet repairs prepared tools for the moment when spring would allow them to return to the fields. Wildlife activity sometimes left dramatic signs across snowy landscapes. A line of hoofprints could stretch across an open meadow before disappearing into forest shadows. Fox tracks curved unpredictably, reflecting sudden changes in direction while hunting. Such markings turned the ground into a temporary record of movement and survival. In larger towns, bakeries continued operating even when markets slowed. Early in the morning, ovens heated by burning wood warmed entire buildings. The smell of baking bread drifted through nearby streets, offering comfort to people walking carefully over icy surfaces. Children living in these communities discovered ways to occupy themselves despite the cold. Some carved small sleds or flat boards to slide down gentle slopes outside village walls. Others sculpted rough figures from packed snow, decorating them with twigs or bits of cloth. These activities brought laughter into otherwise quiet surroundings. At times, strong winds reshaped accumulated snow into smooth ridges that resembled frozen dunes. Travelers approaching such formations climbed slowly over them, careful not to lose footing. Beneath these ridges, earlier footprints vanished completely, making orientation difficult. Farm animals required particular vigilance during extended cold periods. Sheep gathered tightly in enclosures lined with straw, their thick wool offering natural insulation. Cows consumed larger quantities of stored fodder because grazing fields lay hidden beneath deep layers of snow. Farmers rationed these supplies carefully, hoping their reserves would last until grass returned. Winter also influenced trade patterns. Goods that could survive long storage, salted fish, preserved fruit, dried herbs, dominated commerce when roads reopened briefly between storms. Merchants carried smaller loads than usual because transportation remained uncertain. Some evenings unfolded under skies so clear that moonlight illuminated the snowy ground with remarkable brightness. Under such conditions, travelers could sometimes continue short journeys without lanterns. The landscape appeared silver and quiet, interrupted only by distant animal sounds. Medical understanding during that era remained limited, yet people recognized the dangers of prolonged cold exposure. Numb fingers and pale skin signaled the early stages of frostbite. To counter this, individuals warmed their hands near fire or pressed them beneath layers of clothing. Throughout winter, cooperation between neighbors proved essential. One family might help another clear a path to the well. In return, that household could share extra firewood or food supplies during difficult weeks. These exchanges strengthened local relationships built on necessity and mutual trust. Occasionally, storms passed quickly, leaving behind a calm morning where sunlight reflected brilliantly off untouched snow. Such moments created an illusion of peace, even though practical challenges still waited outside every doorway.
Seasonal endurance shaped the outlook of people living during the 16th century. Each winter demanded patience, planning, and adaptability. Long after the final snowfall melted away, memories of those months lingered in stories told beside future fires, reminders that survival had depended on resilience as much as preparation. Long before sunrise, the cold often settled deepest across the land. In the 16th century, that hour just before dawn could feel especially harsh. Darkness lingered, fires burned low, and the air inside homes felt only slightly warmer than the frozen world outside. Someone in the household would rise quietly to stir the embers, adding another log while sparks drifted upward through the chimney. Outside those walls, the countryside looked transformed beyond recognition. Snow concealed the roughness of the ground, smoothing hills and fields into soft curves. Boundaries between farms faded beneath the white surface. A traveler who had known every corner of the region during summer could suddenly feel uncertain about direction. Moving through deep snow required patience and strength. Each step sank downward, forcing legs to lift against resistance again and again. Those who needed to travel any distance sometimes tied bundles of straw around their boots for extra insulation. Others carried long sticks to probe the ground ahead, checking for hidden ditches or streams buried beneath the surface. In forested areas, snow collected unevenly beneath tall branches. Heavy clusters dropped unexpectedly whenever wind shook the trees. A person walking through such woods might hear sudden thumps as clumps crashed onto the ground. The quiet of the forest made every sound more noticeable. The snap of a twig, the rustle of an animal shifting nearby, the distant creak of ice. Village life reorganized itself around the realities of winter. Tasks that required outdoor labor were postponed whenever possible. Instead, indoor crafts took priority. People repaired fishing nets, sharpened knives, patched clothing, and carved wooden tools needed for the coming agricultural season. These activities filled long evenings when darkness arrived early. Preparation of food also adapted to the cold environment. Thick soups simmered slowly over fire, combining grains, roots, and whatever preserved meat remained available. Steam rising from cooking pots warmed nearby faces and fogged small windows. Meals were rarely elaborate, yet the heat they provided mattered greatly during freezing days. Livestock barns developed their own distinctive atmosphere in winter. The warmth produced by animals gathered inside created clouds of vapor whenever doors opened. Farmers stepped carefully between stalls, carrying bundles of hay or buckets of water. The animals themselves often appeared calmer during storms, as if instinctively conserving energy. Mountainous regions presented additional challenges.
Narrow trails that twisted along cliffs could disappear entirely under drifting snow. Experienced guides sometimes led small groups across these routes, relying on memory rather than visible markers. One misstep along such paths carried serious consequences. Meanwhile, coastal communities faced a different set of difficulties. Strong winter winds drove snow inland while waves crashed against frozen shorelines. Fishermen studied the sea carefully before launching their boats. Some chose to wait weeks before returning to open water, repairing nets and mending sails while storms passed overhead. Markets reopened whenever weather allowed movement between settlements. Merchants arrived cautiously with sleds loaded with durable goods. Salted fish, preserved fruit, barrels of grain, and bundles of firewood became valuable trade items during cold months. Transactions occurred quickly, since everyone preferred returning indoors before another storm arrived. Children observed these seasonal changes with curiosity. Footprints left behind by passing animals became small mysteries waiting to be solved. Some followed those tracks across fields simply to discover where they led. Others spent time shaping snow into simple forts or tunnels near their homes. Across open plains, strong gusts sometimes swept snow into towering ridges. These formations shifted gradually as wind continued pushing loose crystals across the surface. A road visible one day might vanish entirely the next, forcing travelers to search for alternate routes. Communication between distant regions slowed considerably under such conditions. Messengers riding horses often paused at inns along major routes, waiting until roads became passable again. Letters traveled slowly from one settlement to another, carried across landscapes that resisted easy movement. Even clothing required constant attention during severe cold. Layers of wool trapped body heat, yet moisture from melting snow could freeze quickly once temperatures dropped again. People dried garments near fireplaces whenever possible, turning them carefully so fabric would not scorch. For those who lived in castles or fortified structures, winter altered daily routines as well. Guards patrolled walls coated with frost, their breath visible in the air. Courtyards filled with packed snow where servants cleared narrow paths between buildings. The thick stone walls provided protection from wind, but they also held cold inside their chambers. Despite the hardships, winter sometimes revealed unexpected beauty. Frost formed delicate patterns across window glass. Icicles hung from rooftops like rows of clear blades catching faint sunlight. Moonlit nights illuminated the ground so brightly that entire villages appeared outlined in pale silver. Occasionally, a brief thaw interrupted the season. Snow softened, dripping from branches and rooftops. Mud replaced hard ice for a short time before temperatures fell again. These temporary changes reminded people that the long, cold stretch would eventually end. Gradually, subtle signs hinted at the coming transformation of the landscape. The sun lingered slightly longer each afternoon. Water began moving beneath the snow, creating faint trickling sounds beneath the surface. Birds returned in small numbers, testing the shifting air. By the time the last frozen patches finally disappeared from fields and roads, communities had already endured months of adjustment. Winter had shaped their routines, tested their preparations, and forced cooperation between neighbors. What remained afterward was not merely relief, but also a quiet awareness that survival through such seasons depended on patience, planning, and the ability to adapt whenever nature demanded it.
Gray light filtering through a cloud-covered sky often signaled another demanding day in a 16th-century winter. The ground might already be buried beneath layers of frozen crystals from earlier storms, yet new flakes could begin falling again without warning. For people living in that era, winter was rarely a single dramatic event. It unfolded as a long sequence of challenges that gradually reshaped the rhythm of life. Across farming regions, the shape of the land became unfamiliar. Furrows carved during autumn plowing disappeared beneath thick white blankets. Wooden fences that once divided properties sank halfway into the drifts. Travelers walking across open ground sometimes realized that familiar landmarks had vanished beneath the surface, forcing them to rely on distant hills or the outline of a church tower to keep their direction. Movement required deliberate effort. A person carrying supplies between buildings might push through heavy snow that reached above the knees. Progress slowed to a careful trudge. Breathing produced clouds of vapor that drifted away on the wind. Even short trips demanded planning because the cold drained energy quickly. Within cottages and larger homes alike, interior spaces filled with the quiet sounds of winter routines. Someone stirred a pot hanging over the fire. Another person scraped frost from the inside of a small window to let a little daylight into the room. Wooden floors creaked softly as family members moved around wearing thick layers of clothing. The smell of smoke lingered everywhere during cold months. Fireplaces burned for long stretches of the day, sometimes filling rooms with the scent of oak, pine, or whatever wood had been gathered earlier in the year. Chimneys carried the smoke upward, though gusts of wind occasionally forced it back inside, causing eyes to water until the draft corrected itself. Many communities relied heavily on cooperation to maintain basic access routes. After especially heavy storms, neighbors joined together to dig narrow passages between houses, barns, and wells. These paths looked like shallow trenches carved into the snow, just wide enough for a single person or small sled to pass through. Farmers continued caring for animals despite the weather. Inside barns, lanterns flickered against wooden beams while livestock shifted restlessly in their stalls. Water froze rapidly in troughs, forcing farmers to break the ice repeatedly throughout the day. Feed stored from summer harvests became increasingly valuable as winter stretched on. In forests, the atmosphere changed dramatically once snow settled across the ground. Every sound seemed amplified in the otherwise silent environment. The flutter of wings from a startled bird echoed between trees. The distant crack of a branch breaking could travel far through the cold air. Hunters sometimes took advantage of these conditions. Fresh snow preserved clear tracks left by passing animals. By studying those marks carefully, a skilled hunter could determine direction, speed, and even the approximate size of the creature that left them behind. Tracking required patience, but the snow made reading the landscape easier. Villages located near rivers experienced another unusual transformation when temperatures remained low for extended periods. Waterways hardened into wide sheets of ice. Residents cautiously stepped onto these frozen surfaces after testing them with long poles. Once considered safe, the ice allowed people to cross areas that normally required bridges or ferries. Meanwhile, strong winds sweeping across open plains sculpted the snow into irregular patterns. Some drifts rose higher than a person's waist, forming barriers that forced travelers to change their route. These shapes shifted constantly as loose snow blew across the surface like pale dust. Winter also influenced social life in subtle ways. With outdoor gatherings limited by the cold, families spent more time indoors, sharing stories, songs, and simple games. Oral traditions passed from one generation to another during such evenings, preserved beside flickering firelight. In larger settlements, craft workshops remained active throughout the season. Tanners worked with hides that would later become clothing or boots. Weavers transformed wool into thick fabric designed to trap warmth. Carpenters repaired sleds, doors, and storage chests damaged by moisture or freezing temperatures. The presence of snow affected military movement as well. Armies attempting to march across frozen landscapes faced logistical difficulties. Wagons loaded with equipment struggled to move efficiently, while soldiers carried heavy clothing that restricted their movement. Campaign plans sometimes changed entirely because winter made progress too slow. Religious buildings offered a different atmosphere during the coldest months. Candles lined the interior walls, while congregations gathered beneath high ceilings, where breath formed faint clouds in the air. Despite the cold stone floors and chilly surroundings, many people attended services regularly, seeing them as moments of comfort during long winters. Weather patterns during the 16th century occasionally produced particularly severe seasons remembered for decades afterward. Chronicles written by monks or local officials sometimes recorded winters when snowfall lasted for weeks without interruption. Such years became reference points in memory, used to compare later storms. Children continued to find amusement despite the difficulties adults associated with winter. They rolled large balls of packed snow across courtyards or slid down gentle slopes near village edges. Their laughter carried across otherwise quiet landscapes. Gradually, subtle shifts hinted that the harshest period would not last forever. Sunlight began appearing earlier in the morning. Snow along southern slopes melted slightly during the afternoon before freezing again overnight. Streams hidden beneath thick layers of ice started producing faint sounds of moving water. When the final stage of winter approached, entire communities noticed the difference. Birds returned to rooftops. Drips from melting icicles created small puddles along pathways. The land slowly reemerged from beneath its frozen covering. Months earlier, the same fields and roads had vanished beneath heavy storms. Now they gradually returned, revealing fences, stones, and footpaths that had remained hidden for so long. Life shifted once more, leaving behind a quiet record of endurance shaped by one more winter in the 16th century. Across the countryside of the 16th century, winter did not simply arrive, it gradually tightened its grip over weeks. At first, the air sharpened, rivers slowed, and frost began forming along roof edges. Eventually, the landscape surrendered entirely to snow. Once that stage arrived, ordinary routines transformed into careful negotiations with cold and distance. Farmers who stepped outside their homes during these months often encountered a world stripped of color. Fields once marked by rows of crops became smooth white expanses. Stone walls sank into drifts until only their upper edges remained visible. A person walking across such terrain relied on memory rather than sight to determine where boundaries once stood. Cold weather influenced sound in unusual ways. Noise traveled farther through frozen air. The crack of an axe striking wood in a distant forest might echo across fields. Barking dogs could be heard from neighboring farms long before their houses came into view. Even footsteps produced a crisp crunch that carried across quiet ground. Inside houses, daily activity focused heavily on maintaining warmth. Fireplaces demanded constant attention because letting the flames die completely could leave rooms dangerously cold. People often kept a small pile of kindling within reach so that fading embers could be revived quickly. Smoke drifting from chimneys created thin gray trails against pale winter skies. Water presented a persistent challenge during extended freezes. Wells developed layers of ice that had to be broken before buckets could descend. Streams slowed until their surfaces hardened into fragile shells, covering flowing water beneath. Collecting even a small amount of liquid required patience and effort. Some regions experienced strong winds that shaped the snow into ridges stretching across open land. These formations changed constantly as fresh gusts lifted loose crystals and carried them elsewhere. Travelers approaching such areas moved cautiously, aware that hidden depressions might lie beneath the drifting surface. Agricultural work shifted away from fields during this time of year. Farmers repaired tools stored after the previous harvest. Wooden handles were replaced, iron edges sharpened, and broken parts reshaped near small workshops warmed by fire.
These tasks prepared equipment for the return of warmer seasons. Domestic life also adapted to winter's limitations. Many families devoted time to spinning wool into thread. The soft hum of spinning wheels filled rooms where flames flickered quietly. Later, that thread would become woven cloth, strong enough to endure harsh outdoor conditions. Food preparation relied heavily on preservation techniques developed over generations. Meat cured with salt hung from beams in cool storage rooms. Vegetables fermented inside sealed containers. Grains stored in large sacks formed the foundation of daily meals. Without these methods, surviving winter would have been nearly impossible. Children sometimes turned the season's difficulties into opportunities for play. They carved small sleds from wood scraps and raced them down gentle slopes. Others molded snow into crude shapes resembling animals or imaginary creatures. These moments of laughter briefly interrupted the seriousness surrounding winter survival. Livestock management required careful planning. Animals sheltered in barns produced warmth simply through their presence, yet they still needed adequate food and water. Farmers monitored them closely, ensuring that stored hay lasted until spring grass returned. In towns surrounded by defensive walls, narrow streets gradually filled with packed snow. Residents cleared pathways near their doorways repeatedly as fresh layers accumulated. Market squares that usually bustled with activity became quieter, though essential trade continued whenever roads reopened.
Travel remained risky when storms intensified. A person caught outside during heavy snowfall could lose orientation within minutes. Visibility dropped rapidly, turning even familiar roads into uncertain routes. Those forced to travel carried lanterns or torches, though wind often made keeping a flame difficult. Forests during winter possessed a striking atmosphere. Tall trees held clusters of snow that occasionally dropped to the ground with muffled thuds. Animal tracks traced delicate patterns across untouched surfaces. The forest seemed both peaceful and watchful at the same time. Some communities located near frozen lakes discovered unusual advantages during extremely cold periods. Once thick ice formed, sleds loaded with supplies could slide directly across surfaces that normally required long detours around water. This temporary route reduced travel time, though it remained dependent on stable temperatures. Craftsmen living in towns often continued their work regardless of weather conditions. Blacksmiths hammered glowing metal inside workshops filled with heat and sparks. Tanners treated animal hides that would later become coats or boots. The presence of fire in these workplaces made them welcome gathering spots for people escaping the cold. Evenings stretched long because winter daylight faded quickly. Families gathered near hearths where the glow of flames illuminated wooden walls. Stories passed between generations, recounting earlier winters remembered for unusual storms or remarkable survival. Occasionally, the sky cleared completely after days of snowfall. Under such conditions, the moon reflected brilliantly off the white ground, creating enough brightness to cast faint shadows. Entire villages appeared bathed in pale silver light during these calm nights. The cold season also influenced regional politics and military planning. Armies attempting long marches encountered obstacles created by deep snow and frozen terrain. Supply lines slowed dramatically, forcing commanders to reconsider campaigns until warmer months returned. Despite these hardships, winter landscapes sometimes inspired quiet reflection. People stepping outside during calm mornings saw frost sparkling along branches and rooftops. Breath drifted through still air, while the world seemed suspended in silence. Eventually, subtle signs signaled a gradual shift. Sunlight lingered slightly longer each afternoon. Icicles began dripping during midday warmth. Beneath the snow, streams resumed their hidden movement. Weeks later, the thick white covering started shrinking from fields and roads. Patches of earth reappeared,
revealing the contours that had vanished earlier in the season. Villagers resumed outdoor tasks with renewed energy. What remained after winter's retreat was not merely a change in temperature, but a memory of endurance. Communities that passed through such seasons carried forward the knowledge that preparation, cooperation, and patience were essential for facing the next arrival of cold.